auditory processing disorder. My question is, how can you teach him things? Is there a way to teach him?
Well, I'm not being a licensed clinician, I probably shouldn't give specific advice, but I would recommend working with a clinician. There are programs, some of them implemented on a computer, that try to train children to pay more attention to the subtle aspects of language that ordinarily can slip by, paying attention to the differences between consonants that sound alike, to the order of consonants in clusters of consonants. And even though it might be harder to begin with, if you're in that part of the spectrum, practice can certainly help you along.
You are an atheist. Mm-hmm. Did the atheism come before your work on the brain or after?
I can't remember a time at which I really believed in God, at least thinking other than just accepting Bible stories as they were narrated. Mm-hmm. So I don't remember any epiphany. It just was never really part of my worldview. And so it naturally morphed into an interest in the science of mind and brain. It was never a shock to me that thinking consists of brain cells firing in patterns, that our consciousness is a function of our brain activity. To some people, to some readers of How the Mind Works, this was the biggest shock of the book, something that I think most brain scientists and cognitive scientists don't even think about, because they just walk into the door with a naturalistic view mm-hmm. of the mind and brain.
You wrote the soul is in fact the information processing activity of the brain, but that was controversial.
Yes, and I probably wrote that in response to people who first pointed out that was an implication of this mm-hmm. worldview. But yeah, and that's not a statement of faith or dogma, but it's a result of what we've learned about thought and feeling, namely that there isn't any aspect of it that can't be pinned down to brain function. If you mess with the chemistry of the brain by taking drugs, you can get changes in mood and personality and even perception in the case of hallucinogens. If a part of the brain becomes damaged, a part of the person can become lost. If you sever the connections between the two cerebral hemispheres as a surgical treatment, it's as if there are two consciousnesses in the same skull. So we just know from countless kinds of brain studies and brain manipulation that that's where consciousness and thought and feeling reside.
Yeah, pegging off of that, here's an emailer who says, can you describe exactly what happens when one experiences a psychotic break? Why is the mind then unable to recover from this? Or when is it unable to recover from it?
Well, this is, I guess, I'm not really an expert in psychopathology, mm-hmm. but I mean, in broad outline, there seem to be genetic causes of differences in brain activity, sometimes perhaps due to brain structure, because we know that almost all psychiatric disorders are partly heritable. There seems to be disruption in some of the neurotransmitter systems. That is, the neurons or brain cells influence each other by releasing little dabs of chemicals that seep across a little gap. And there are complex systems in the brain that regulate the amounts of those different kinds of chemicals. Those seem to be out of whack in some cases of psychosis. It's not true invariably that a person with a psychotic break can never recover. They'll probably never be indistinguishable from a person who's never had such a break. But there are cases of recovery. Perhaps the mathematician John Nash, portrayed in the movie A Beautiful Mind, would be the most famous example. Not a typical example, but it does happen.
Richmond, Virginia, you're next with Steven Pinker. Go ahead. Richmond, are you there? Please.
Hello, my name is Ben Green. My name is Benjamin Green. I'd like to know what is the definition of DNA in regards to IQ and race. And I'd also like to know, is the author familiar with Dr. Charles Murray and Richard J. Herrnstein? I think I'm pronouncing that right.
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is Herrnstein and Murray 14 years ago, wrote a book called The Bell Curve. I knew Richard Herrnstein. He was one of my graduate school teachers, and I know Charles Murray, who works here in Washington at the American Enterprise Institute. The book I think the subtitle was Class Structure and Intelligence in American Life, and it was about the underappreciated role of intelligence in many social outcomes. The fact that intelligence predicts outcomes like employment, income, social status, crime, child abuse, statistically. I mean, it's not destiny. And in one chapter, they then applied it to some of the black-white differences in America, arguing that the causes of the black-white difference in outcomes were not 100% environmental, but some mixture of environment and genetics. I assume that was what you had in mind when asking about the relevance of DNA to intelligence. My own reading is I was not persuaded by that particular chapter, and that's the chapter that people think was the point of the whole book. The rest of the book, I mean, putting aside the black-white difference, but just within races, the differences between one white person and another, difference between one black person and another, I think there is an influence of intelligence, and I think part of the influence of intelligence is an influence of the genes. So I think that they were closer to the scientific consensus in talking about intelligence in general when they applied it to race differences, and I think they would be the first to agree. The evidence is much more equivocal, and I have never endorsed that particular chapter, even though there's much else in the book that I did find persuasive.
Prescott, Arizona, go ahead.
Massillon, Ohio.
Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, I wonder if we could retreat from anthropocentrism just a little bit. And Dr. Pinker, you mentioned very early on in the conversation we needed to be smart to survive. I was just wondering, and I'm also hoping Connie will let me sneak in a second question here. I was just wondering, your definition of intelligence, how far, if you will, accept the term down, would you say that it goes? Would it go to microorganisms or even to information carried by a quantum of energy, for example? And is it just an accretion process that we eventually identify? And how far up to something, if you'll accept that term, to something like artificial intelligence of the kind that Ray Kurzweil might talk about in reverse engineering of the brain? And just sort of put parameters on your definition of intelligence. And I do have one other question.
Okay. I certainly wouldn't define intelligence in a way that would restrict it to humans, so some kind of species chauvinism. If you want to understand what human intelligence is, you've got to have some independent idea of what it means to be intelligent. Roughly, I would say that intelligence is the ability to achieve goals in multiple ways. That is, if there's a system has to be goal-oriented for intelligence even to apply to it, and that's why I think just information of the kind that could be carried by electrons or quanta doesn't itself count as information as intelligence unless you do something with it to get something. If you can get to that something by multiple routes, then that's, I think, corresponds with what we mean by intelligence. William James had a wonderful passage where he said, what's the difference between, say, Romeo approaching Juliet and iron filings approaching a magnet? Why do we say one of them is intelligent, the other one's not? And he said, well, imagine that a wall was put between Romeo and Juliet. Well, Romeo and Juliet wouldn't idiotically press their lips against opposite sides of the wall the way iron filings in a magnet would if there's a card between them. Romeo would find some other way of getting to Juliet by going around the wall or over the wall or knocking down the wall. That is, he'd use different courses of action, all united by the fact that they bring about the same goal. So by that standard, many other organisms are intelligent. I don't think humans are the only intelligent organism, although we're probably the most intelligent. But you can see that when dogs and cats and rats and so on can adapt their behavior flexibly to attain something that they want. I think there's a kind in microorganisms. I think they're not intelligent because there are fixed mechanical rules, ways of getting a goal. But one could say that there's a kind of intelligence in their in the way that evolution put them together, and that in the same way that the process of evolution can give rise to signs of design in